Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient oak grove as dawn breaks across the Celtic lands. Mist clings to gnarled roots that have drunk from this earth for centuries. Through the pale light, figures emerge, white-robed, silent, moving, with the deliberate grace of those who walk between worlds. These are the Druids, and they are gathering for a ceremony that connects heaven and earth, past and future, the seen and unseen. In their hands, golden sickles catch the first rays of sun. Above them, rare mistletoe grows on the sacred oak, its pale berries promising healing, fertility, protection. This is no mere superstition. This is knowledge accumulated over lifetimes, passed mouth to ear through 20 years of rigorous training. This is the religion of a civilization that will soon face its greatest trial, the unstoppable advance of Rome, and later, the equally relentless spread of Christianity. The Druids stand at a threshold they cannot yet perceive, between an ancient world and its extinction, between living tradition and enduring myth. The story of the Celtic Druids spans nearly a millennium of documented history and stretches far deeper into the unrecorded past. It is a story of wisdom and power, of nature worship and political authority, of spectacular rituals and brutal suppression. It is also a story shrouded in deliberate mystery, for the Druids themselves refused to commit their sacred knowledge to writing. Everything we know comes filtered through the eyes of outsiders. Greek geographers, Roman generals, Christian monks, each with their own agendas, their own axes to grind. Yet, through these fragmentary accounts, a compelling portrait emerges of a priestly caste unlike any other in the ancient world. The word druid itself whispers of ancient forests. Most scholars trace it to Proto-Celtic roots combining dru, oak, with wid, to know. The Druids were, quite literally, those who possessed knowledge of the oak tree, but this etymology hints at something far deeper than botanical expertise. In Celtic cosmology, the oak represented strength, endurance, and the axis connecting earthly and divine realms. To know the oak was to understand the fundamental structure of reality itself. The earliest written references to Druids appear in Greek texts from the 4th century BCE, though the tradition itself clearly extends much further back. By the time Julius Caesar encountered them during his conquest of Gaul in the 50s BCE, the Druidic orders had developed into a sophisticated intellectual class with clearly defined hierarchies and specialized roles. Caesar, whose accounts remain our most detailed ancient source despite his obvious biases, described the Druids as wielding extraordinary influence across Celtic society. But who could become a Druid? The path was neither easy nor short. Aspiring candidates, often the sons and daughters of nobility, for the Druidic class was open to both sexes, committed to training programs that could last 2 decades or more. During this time, they memorized vast repositories of verse, natural philosophy, astronomy, and sacred lore. No books, no scrolls, no written aids. Everything committed to memory through the ancient technology of oral transmission. A single Druid might carry in their mind knowledge equivalent to entire libraries, reciting genealogies stretching back generations, legal precedents covering every conceivable dispute, astronomical observations accumulated over centuries, and ritual procedures of exacting precision. This oral tradition was no accident of primitive technology. The Druids possessed writing. They used Greek letters for mundane business, but deliberately refused to record their sacred teachings. Ancient sources suggest they feared that written knowledge could be corrupted, stolen, or misunderstood. True wisdom required the relationship between teacher and student, the nuance of spoken word, the living transmission from one generation to the next. The Druids occupied multiple roles that, in modern societies, would be sharply divided. They served as priests presiding over religious ceremonies and interpreting divine will. As judges, they resolved disputes ranging from property boundaries to matters of tribal warfare, their decisions backed by the gravest of sanctions. Exclusion from religious rites, which Celtic peoples considered a fate worse than death. As advisors to kings, they wielded political influence that often exceeded the monarchs they counseled. The Greek writer Strabo claimed that, among the Gauls, Druids could stop armies poised for battle simply by walking between the opposing forces. They were also physicians, astronomers, philosophers, and educators. Ancient sources record Druids studying the movement of stars, developing both lunar and solar calendars with remarkable precision. Archaeological evidence at sites like Newgrange in Ireland, where a passage aligns perfectly with the winter solstice sunrise, demonstrates the sophisticated astronomical knowledge embedded in Celtic culture, knowledge almost certainly preserved and transmitted by Druids. Yet, for all their learning, Druids were not cloistered academics. They moved freely through Celtic territories, crossing boundaries that warriors could not. Even warring tribes granted Druids safe passage, recognizing their status as beyond ordinary political conflicts. At sacred sites like the Grove of the Carnutes in Gaul, believed to be the spiritual center of the Celtic world, Druids from across vast regions would gather annually to settle legal disputes and maintain their collective body of knowledge. The sacred landscape of the Druids was not built by human hands. Their temples were living things, groves of ancient trees, springs bubbling from secret places, mountains touching the sky. These were the Nemeton, holy sanctuaries where the boundary between mortal and divine grew thin. While later Celtic peoples would construct some permanent shrines, the earliest Druids conducted their most important rituals in forest clearings, particularly among oak groves. Why oak? Beyond symbolic resonance, oak forests created a specific atmospheric quality. The high canopy filtered sunlight into dappled patterns, creating a sense of otherworldly illumination. The massive trunks spoke of endurance across human lifetimes, and, crucially, oaks hosted mistletoe, the parasitic plant that remained green through winter's death, growing from what appeared to be dead wood, an emblem of life persisting through darkness. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, left us the only detailed description of a Druidic ritual that survives from the ancient world. His account of the mistletoe ceremony has shaped popular imagination ever since, though we must remember Pliny was an outsider describing practices he likely never witnessed firsthand. According to Pliny, the Druids held nothing more sacred than mistletoe growing on an oak, a rare occurrence, as mistletoe more commonly parasitizes softer wooded trees. When discovered, the finding prompted elaborate preparations. On the 6th day of the moon, when lunar influence was strong but not yet full, the Druids would gather, dressed in white robes that marked their sacred office. They would prepare a ritual sacrifice and feast beneath the host tree. 2 white bulls would be brought, their horns bound for the first time. Young animals, perfect specimens representing vitality and worth, their white coloring marked them as belonging to the other world, set apart from ordinary beasts. A priest would climb the oak, or perhaps stand on the bull's back, according to some interpretations, wielding a golden sickle. This tool was no casual choice. Gold represented solar power, masculine principle. The sickle blade curved like the moon, feminine principle. Together they united complementary forces. With precise cuts, the Druid would sever the mistletoe, catching it in a white cloth before it could touch the ground. The plant must not be contaminated by earth, must maintain its sky-dwelling purity. Then came the sacrifice of the bulls, their blood feeding the land, their lives exchanged for the mistletoe's power. The plant would be brewed into an elixir believed to cure infertility and neutralize all poisons. An all-heal of remarkable potency. But mistletoe ceremonies were just one thread in a complex fabric of Druidic practice. The sacred calendar, organized around solar and lunar cycles, marked crucial moments when divine forces could be accessed. Samhain, celebrated around October 31st, marked the end of the harvest year and the beginning of winter's darkness. It was a threshold time when the veil between worlds grew thin, when ancestors could return and future events might be glimpsed. Beltane, on May 1st, celebrated the opposite threshold, winter's end and summer's beginning. Livestock would be driven between 2 bonfires for purification and protection. These weren't mere festivals but essential maintenance of cosmic order, ensuring the sun would return, crops would grow, cattle would thrive. The Druids served as technicians of the sacred, performing the precise operations needed to keep reality functioning. Human sacrifice features prominently in Roman accounts of Druidic religion, though we must approach these claims with appropriate skepticism. Romans had clear propaganda motivations for portraying Celts as barbaric, justifying imperial conquest as a civilizing mission. Yet, archaeological evidence suggests the practice did occur, though perhaps not as frequently as Roman sources claimed. Bodies recovered from peat bogs show signs of ritual killing, the triple death, involving strangulation, drowning, and stabbing. Whether these were criminals, willing sacrifices, or offerings during desperate times remains debated. What seems clear is that Druids held fundamentally different conceptions of death than we do. They preached the immortality and transmigration of souls, the belief that death merely transferred consciousness from one vessel to another. This teaching, according to Caesar, was why Celtic warriors fought with such apparent recklessness. Death held no terror for those certain they would live again. The Druids also practiced divination in forms that would seem shocking to modern sensibilities. Roman sources describe priests interpreting the future from the convulsions of human victims, reading omens in the pattern of blood flow and organ arrangement. Whether literal truth or Roman fabrication, these accounts reveal how profoundly alien Druidic worldviews were to Mediterranean civilization. The collision between Celtic Druids and Roman power was perhaps inevitable. Rome built empires through standardization, common laws, common gods absorbed into the vast pantheon, common administration. The Druids represented something Rome could not easily assimilate: a decentralized but powerful authority that transcended tribal boundaries, that commanded loyalties deeper than any emperor could purchase. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BCE brought him into direct confrontation with Druidic power. His accounts, while serving his own political purposes, reveal grudging respect for their influence. Caesar noted that Druids were exempt from military service and paid no tribute, privileges that attracted many to their ranks. He observed their annual gatherings, their resolution of disputes, their education of noble youth, but Caesar also recognized them as obstacles to Roman control. By maintaining Celtic identity, preserving tribal histories, and commanding religious authority, Druids provided the ideological infrastructure for resistance. Their teachings of immortality made warriors less fearful of death. Their ability to coordinate between tribes threatened Roman divide-and-conquer strategies. The systematic suppression began under Augustus, around 12 BCE, who banned Druidic practices throughout the Roman Empire. His successors, Tiberius and Claudius, intensified the campaign during the 1st century CE, but the decisive blow came in 60 CE on an island off the coast of Wales. Anglesey, or Mona as the Romans called it, had become the last major Druidic stronghold in Britain. As Roman legions advanced through the Celtic territories, Druids and refugees fled to this windswept island that had long served as a sacred center. Here were the great groves, the ancient shrines, centuries of accumulated wisdom and power. Suetonius Paulinus, governor of Britain, determined to break this final bastion of resistance. The Roman historian Tacitus, who heard first-hand accounts from participants, left us a vivid description of the assault. As Roman troops approached the Menai Strait in flat-bottomed boats, with cavalry swimming alongside their horses, they encountered a sight that struck terror into their hearts. On the beach stood the Celtic army in dense formation. Between the ranks, women ran in black robes like furies, hair disheveled, brandishing burning torches, and in a circle, Druids raised their hands to heaven, pouring forth terrible curses and imprecations. The spectacle was so extraordinary that Roman soldiers froze, paralyzed by supernatural dread. They stood exposed to weapons without attempting defense. Only their generals' exhortations broke the spell. Ashamed to quail before a troop of frenzied women, the legions advanced. They smashed through the defenders, cutting down Druids and warriors alike. Then came the systematic destruction of everything sacred. The groves were felled, altars running with sacrificial blood were demolished, shrines were burned. Roman sources claim they found evidence of human sacrifice that justified their actions, though we should remember the propaganda value of such claims. Tacitus reports that the groves were consecrated to savage cults, where captive blood drenched the altars and human entrails consulted for prophecy, whether accurate reporting or justification for cultural destruction. The Roman assault on Anglesey represented something more than military conquest. It was an attack on the spiritual heart of Celtic Britain, an attempt to sever the ties binding the people together. Yet, even this catastrophe was incomplete. Suetonius had to withdraw his forces to deal with Boudicca's rebellion, possibly sparked partly by outrage at the assault on Druidic sanctuaries. The island enjoyed a reprieve of 17 years before Gnaeus Julius Agricola returned in 77 CE to complete the subjugation. This time, Roman control was permanent. The Druids were scattered, their groves destroyed, their traditions driven underground or simply lost. In Gaul, the suppression followed similar patterns. Sacred sites were appropriated for Roman temples. Druidic practices were outlawed. Those who persisted faced execution. By the 2nd century CE, Druids had effectively vanished from the historical record in territories under Roman control. But absence from Roman documents does not mean complete extinction. In Ireland, which the Romans never conquered, Druids continued to function well into the Christian era. And even in Roman territories, elements of Druidic knowledge survived in transformed guises. In the practices of rural healers, in folk customs preserving traces of ancient festivals, in the memories of peoples who would not entirely forget. The relationship between Christianity and the Druids is far more complex than simple tales of St. Patrick driving the snakes from Ireland suggest. That metaphor? Snakes representing Druids, the serpent symbol of wisdom, captures something of the cultural transformation, but the reality involved both violent suppression and remarkable synthesis. Christianity arrived in Ireland during the 5th century CE, brought by missionaries like Patrick, who had absorbed the Roman method of religious conquest. Appropriate the sacred sites, transform the festivals, absorb what you can and destroy what you cannot. But Ireland was not Rome. Here, Christianity encountered Druids at the height of their power, embedded in every aspect of society, commanders of respect and authority. Medieval hagiographies paint dramatic confrontations between Patrick and Druids at the Hill of Tara, where the High King and his spiritual advisors gathered for sacred festivals. These accounts, written centuries after the events they describe, mix history with propaganda. They show Patrick demonstrating superior power through miracles, Druids attempting counter-magic and failing, mass conversions following dramatic victories. Yet, the real story was likely messier and more interesting. Some Druids violently opposed Christianity and met violent ends, if we believe the hagiographies, but many others saw in Christianity something familiar. The Trinity resonated with Celtic fascination with triadic symbolism. The three realms, the triple goddess, the threefold structure of reality. Christian concepts of resurrection echoed Druidic teachings about death and rebirth. Monasticism's emphasis on learning, contemplation, and connection to sacred landscapes paralleled Druidic practice. More pragmatically, Druids possessed exactly the skills early Christian churches needed. They were educated, disciplined, already respected community leaders fluent in oral tradition and ritual practice. Many Druids converted and became Christian priests, bringing with them their knowledge, their authority, and inevitably, elements of their earlier worldview. Saint Columba, who founded crucial monasteries in both Ireland and Scotland, is reputed to have received Druidic training before his conversion. This synthesis produced something unique: Celtic Christianity, with its distinctive character that blended Christian theology with Celtic spiritual sensibilities. Irish monasteries became centers of learning that preserved both Christian texts and pre-Christian literature. The monks who compiled the great mythological cycles, the Tain Bo Cuailnge, the Mabinogion, were Christians recording pagan stories, often adding their own interpretations but also preserving knowledge that would otherwise have vanished. The Druidic class didn't disappear so much as transform. They became the Fili, poet-historians who maintained genealogies and composed praise poetry. They became the Brehons, legal experts who preserved and interpreted ancient Irish law well into the medieval period. They became the bards, musicians and storytellers, who carried cultural memory through song and verse. These professions inherited Druidic knowledge minus its explicitly religious functions, which Christianity had claimed. Elements of Druidic practice survived in Christianized forms. Sacred wells became associated with saints, but retained their healing reputations. Ancient festival dates became church holy days. Samhain transformed into All Hallows' Eve. Beltane merged with celebrations of spring saints. Oak groves that once hosted Druidic rites became sites for Christian churches. The monastery at Kildare, founded by St. Brigid, takes its name from Sildara, Church of the Oak, suggesting direct continuity with pre-Christian sacred sites. Yet, we must not romanticize this transformation. The syncretic blending coexisted with brutal suppression. Christian authorities burned Druidic manuscripts. One account claims Patrick personally destroyed 180 books. Sacred groves were felled. Rituals were outlawed. Those who maintained the old ways too openly faced persecution. By the 7th century, druid, in Irish law texts, had become a term meaning sorcerer or witch doctor. A dramatic fall from their former status. The profound knowledge they had preserved for centuries was dismissed as superstition. Their spiritual authority transferred to Christian priests. Their social roles fragmented among specialized successors. The Druids vanished from active practice, but their fascination only grew in absence. Medieval writers, even while condemning them as pagans, couldn't hide a certain wistful admiration for these keepers of ancient wisdom. By the time of the Renaissance, scholars began seriously studying classical accounts of Druids, trying to piece together what had been lost. The 18th century brought full-fledged Druid revival, as the Romantic movement embraced everything ancient, mystical, and connected to nature. Antiquarians like William Stukeley conducted the first archaeological surveys of megalithic monuments, mistakenly attributing sites like Stonehenge to Druids, despite these structures predating Druidic culture by thousands of years. The error stuck. To this day, many people associate Druids with Stonehenge, though the monument was already ancient when the first Druids emerged. These romantic Druids bore little resemblance to their ancient counterparts. They became wise philosophers, proto-scientists, noble savages unspoiled by civilization's corruption. They became whatever their interpreters needed them to be. Early Christians preserving gospel truth, ancient democrats opposing tyranny, mystical adepts of secret wisdom, architects of impossible monuments. Modern Druidic orders emerged, claiming descent from or revival of ancient practices. The order of bards, ovates, and druids, founded in the 20th century, draws on historical sources, Celtic mythology, and contemporary spiritual practice to create a living tradition that acknowledges discontinuity with ancient Druids while honoring their legacy. But what actually survived? Fragments, mostly. Customs whose origins had been forgotten, but which preserved traces of Druidic practice. The Irish and Welsh languages themselves, carrying words and concepts that reflect pre-Christian worldviews. Archaeological sites that hint at the astronomical knowledge and sacred geography Druids maintained. Folk traditions about healing wells, sacred trees, and liminal times of year. And perhaps something subtler. A Celtic sensibility toward nature, poetry, learning, and the thin places where divine presence breaks through. The Druids live on in the Irish monk copying manuscripts with devotion equal to any Druidic student memorizing verse. In the Welsh bard, maintaining genealogies and composing praise poetry. In the Scottish crofter, who still, on the 1st of May, drives cattle between bonfires though the reason has been forgotten. They live on in the questions we still ask. How did they accomplish their feats of memory? What astronomical knowledge did they possess? What did they truly believe about death and rebirth? What wisdom was lost when their oral tradition broke? We can never know with certainty. The Druids kept their secrets too well. This very elusiveness has become part of their power. Unlike other ancient religions conquered by Christianity, their texts preserved, their doctrines debated, their practices documented. Druidism remains mysterious. It invites projection, imagination, endless speculation. Every generation reinvents the Druids according to its own needs and fears. Stand again in that oak grove. The mist is clearing now. The Druids are gone, have been gone for more than 1,000 years. The golden sickle, if it ever existed, has long since turned to dust. The sacred groves were cut down by Roman axes or Christian zealots, or simply the passage of time. Yet, something persists. In the oldest trees that still grow in Ireland and Wales. In the megalithic monuments whose alignment with solstices and equinoxes demonstrates knowledge carefully accumulated and precisely transmitted. In the myths and legends that Christian monks preserved, even as they transformed them. In the very landscape itself, which still marks the places Druids held sacred. The story of the Druids is ultimately a story about cultural transformation and loss. It's about what happens when a tradition based entirely on oral transmission faces violent suppression. It's about knowledge that cannot be recovered once the chain of teacher to student breaks. It's about the hubris of assuming that only written words preserve truth, when the Druids proved that human memory could hold libraries. It's also a story about resilience. Though the Druids themselves vanished, the Celtic peoples who relied on them survived. They adapted, transformed, found new ways to preserve what mattered most. Christianity in Ireland became something distinct from Roman Christianity, precisely because it absorbed and adapted so much from the culture it encountered. The bards and filly and brehons maintained continuity with Druidic knowledge in new forms. And it's a story that continues. Modern Druids may not have unbroken connection to ancient practitioners, but they work with the same fundamental materials: nature, poetry, sacred time, the cycles of sun and moon. They grapple with the same essential questions about humanity's place in the cosmos, about how to live in harmony with natural forces, about what wisdom means. The Druids represented a way of knowing the world that modernity has largely lost, a way that valued memory over documentation, relationship over abstraction, sacred connection over mechanical explanation. We cannot return to their world. We cannot resurrect their practices in authentic form, but we can recognize what was lost, honor what survived, and perhaps learn something from a civilization that found the divine not in temples of stone, but in living groves, not in written scripture, but in the trained memory of dedicated practitioners. As dawn fully breaks and the mist clears, the grove stands empty but somehow expectant, waiting, perhaps, for those who still seek wisdom in the old places, waiting for those who understand that some knowledge lives in the body, in practice, in direct experience of the sacred landscape, waiting for those who remember that the oak, older than human memory, still knows things we have forgotten. If you found this journey into Celtic mystery compelling, if the story of wisdom lost and partially recovered resonates with you, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to this channel. We explore these liminal spaces between history and myth, these stories of ancient worlds that still shape our modern understanding. The Druids have much yet to teach those willing to listen, not through direct instruction, which ended centuries ago, but through the echoes they left behind, the questions they still provoke, the mystery they maintained so carefully that not even their destruction could fully dispel it.